The chains came off. The ocean stretched in every direction, north, south, east, west, and every direction looked exactly the same, blue, endless, empty. 40 men stood on the deck of a ship they had just taken by force. The captain was gone. The crew was gone. The chains were gone. But freedom, it turned out, was not the same as knowing where to go. Only one man on that ship could read the stars. Only one man knew which way the wind was pulling and what it meant. And he had been hiding that knowledge since the day they put him in chains. Because on a slave ship, a man who can sail is worth more than a man who cannot. And worth on a slave ship is the most dangerous thing you can have. This is his story. The first thing Kofi heard was the wood, not the voices, not the chains, the wood. As the hull of the ship groaning against the Atlantic, the way a living thing groans when it is being pressed from every side. A deep, slow, continuous sound that traveled through the beams and into his spine and told him, before his eyes had adjusted to the dark, before his lungs had made peace with the air, exactly what kind of vessel he was inside. A schooner, 2 masts, roughly 120 feet, as moving at perhaps 5 knots, judging by the rhythm of the water against the hull, as heading northwest, based on the way the waves struck the port side at an angle that meant the wind was coming from the south-southeast. He knew all of this in the first 30 seconds. He knew it the way other men know the sound of their mother's voice, not by thinking, but by being. He had grown up on boats. His father had been a fisherman off Cape Coast, Ghana, and before Kofi could walk on land without stumbling, he could balance on a deck in a storm. The sea was his first language. Wood and wind and salt were the alphabet. And the ship he was chained inside was speaking to him in a dialect he understood perfectly. But he said nothing. He kept his hands still and his mouth shut and his eyes on the dark. Because on a slave ship, knowledge is not power. It is a target. A sailor who is captured is not just cargo. He is a tool. He is separated from the others, kept alive for his skill, sold at a premium to captains who need crew. If they discovered what Kofi was, he would disappear into a different kind of slavery. One with no other faces, no shared suffering, no possibility of revolt, just a wheel, a compass, and a lifetime of steering someone else's ship. So he lay in the hold and listened. As 40 men were packed around him in a space built for 20, the air was thick with the smell of sweat, urine, salt water, and the metallic bite of iron shackles rubbing against skin. The chains connected him to 3 other men, ankle to ankle, wrist to wrist, a web of iron that made one body out of 4 and ensured that every movement, every turn, as every attempt to sit up or lie down was a negotiation conducted without words. He could hear them breathing. 40 different rhythms. Some fast and shallow, the breathing of panic. Some slow and deep, the breathing of men who had already surrendered to whatever came next. And one, to his left, 3 bodies down, that was neither fast nor slow. It was steady, deliberate. The breathing of a man who was planning something. That man was Sengbe. Kofi did not know his name yet. He knew him only by the sound of his breath and the particular stillness of his body. A stillness that was not rest but readiness. Over the next 2 nights, that stillness spread. Whispers passed through the dark like a current. A woman, somewhere in the hold, had found a file on the previous ship and hidden it in her clothing. It was being passed from hand to hand, shackle to shackle, working its way through the iron the way water works its way through stone, slowly, persistently, with the patience of people who have nothing left to lose except the time it takes to break free. On the 3rd night, Sengbe's voice came through the dark, low, firm, as speaking in Mende, then in broken Portuguese, then in gestures that the chains forced into a language of their own. Tomorrow, when the moon is behind the clouds, we take the ship. As Kofi heard the plan move through the hold the way fire moves through dry grass, touching everything, changing everything. Impossible to stop. And he thought the thing that no one else was thinking. They planned to take the ship. As good. But then what? 40 farmers and weavers and rice growers on a schooner in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. No one can trim a sail. No one can read a compass. No one can tell east from west by looking at the stars. As they will take the ship and then they will float. And floating on the Atlantic is just a slower way to die, unless someone steps forward. Unless someone who has been hiding decides that the cost of staying hidden is now higher than the cost of being seen. The revolt came before dawn. The file had done its work. The shackles opened. Bare feet hit the wooden deck. Kofi stayed below, pressed against the hull, and listened to the battle through the wood, running, shouting. The clash of metal, cane knives that had been stored in the hold, as now swinging in the hands of men who had never held a weapon but understood, in their bones, that this was the night that divided their lives into before and after. Something heavy fell into the water. Then silence. Then footsteps. Slow, scattered, the footsteps of people who have just won a fight and are only now realizing what winning means. Kofi climbed the ladder. The moonlight hit the deck in broken patches. Sengbi stood at the bow, a cane knife in his hand, his chest rising and falling, his eyes carrying the particular wildness of a man who has just crossed a line he cannot uncross. Behind him, 40 people stood on a ship they now owned. The sails hung loose. The wheel turned unattended. The compass pointed nowhere that mattered, because no one on deck could read it. The ocean stretched in every direction. And freedom, it turned out, was not the same as knowing where to go. As freedom arrived all at once, the way a wave arrives, enormous, overwhelming, and carrying nothing to hold on to. They had broken the chains, but chains, at least, tell you where you are. The ocean tells you nothing. As Handberlinger. By morning, the ship was adrift. The sails caught wind when the wind felt like pushing and hung limp when it didn't. The schooner moved in slow, meaningless circles, the way a man walks when he has been blindfolded and spun around. Always moving, never arriving. Sengbe had kept the navigator alive, a Spaniard named Montes. As thin, gray-bearded, with the particular calm of a man who has already calculated his odds of survival and decided that cooperation is cheaper than courage. Sengbe pointed east. "Africa, take us home." Montes nodded. He took the wheel, he checked the compass, and he began to sail, east by day. The sun at their backs in the morning, the bow pointed toward the horizon where Africa waited, or so they believed. Sengbe watched the compass. As he did not understand the numbers, but he understood the direction of the needle, and the needle pointed the way Montes had promised. Kofi watched the stars. On the first night, he climbed to the deck while the others slept. The sky was enormous, blacker and deeper than any sky he had seen on land. Because at sea there is nothing between you and the universe except the idea that you matter. He found Polaris, the North Star, the fixed point around which everything else revolves. And he saw what no one else on the ship could see. Polaris was moving to the right, not because the star had moved, because the ship had. Montes was turning them north, slowly degrees at a time under the cover of darkness, east by day, north by night. A zigzag course that would carry them not toward Africa but toward the coast of North America, toward the country of the men who had funded the ship that had bought them. The Spaniard was sailing 2 courses, one for the sun, one for the moon, and no one on board had the eyes to see the difference, except Kofi. He said nothing, not that night, as not the next. He lay on the deck and watched the stars drift wrong and felt the weight of knowing. Build inside him the way water builds behind a dam, rising, pressing, looking for the crack. If he spoke, he would reveal what he was, a sailor, a man who could read the sky. And once that knowledge was loose, it could not be put back. The others would look at him differently, as Sengbe would look at him differently. The Spaniard would know that his trick had been discovered, and Kofi, who had survived the hold by being invisible, would become the most visible person on the ship. But if he stayed silent, Montes would deliver them to a coast where chains were waiting. Silence was not safety. It was complicity. And the stars, which had never lied to him in 30 years of sailing, were telling him that the time for hiding was over. On the 4th night, Kofi stood up. He walked across the deck, past the sleeping bodies, past the coiled ropes and the stacked barrels and the dark stain on the wood that no one talked about. He walked to the wheel where Montes sat, as one hand on the compass, the other on the spoke, his eyes fixed on the darkness ahead with the quiet satisfaction of a man who believes he is winning. Kofi stopped beside him. He spoke in Portuguese, not fluent but enough, as he had learned it from the traders who came to Cape Coast, the same traders who had eventually taken him. "You have been sailing north for 3 nights. The hand on the compass froze. Montes looked up. For the first time since the revolt, his carefully constructed calm cracked. "I know," Kofi continued, "because Polaris has been moving to the right since we left. As the only way that happens is if the bow is turning north. You sail east when the sun can prove you right, and north when the dark can hide you." Montes said nothing. His mouth opened and closed, a fish pulled from water, gasping for a language that could save him. Kofi placed his hand on the wheel. The wood was warm. As the resistance of the rudder against the current traveled up his arms and into his chest and settled there, as in the place where the sea had always lived. His fingers found the spokes the way a musician's fingers find, as the keys, by memory, by instinct, by the bone-deep knowledge that this is what they were made for. He turned the wheel, the bow swung east, the sails shifted. The ship shuddered, then settled into a new line, a true line, pointed toward a horizon that finally meant something. Sengbe appeared beside him. He had been woken by the change in motion. A sailor would call it the feel of the ship finding its course, and Sengbei, though he did not have the words, had felt it too. "Who are you?" he said. Kofi did not look away from the horizon. "As I am the man who is going to take you home. You used the stars to steal our direction. I will use the same stars to take it back. The difference between us is not knowledge. It is what we choose to do with it. The Atlantic Ocean is not one thing. It is 1,000 things wearing the same color. Close to the African coast, the water runs warm and dark, as heavy with the sediment of rivers that have been pouring into it since before men had names. Farther out, it turns a blue so deep it looks like the sky has fallen and forgotten how to get back up. Near the American coast, it changes again, greener, colder, restless with currents that run like underground rivers beneath the surface." Kofi read these changes the way his father had taught him, not from charts, from the water itself, the temperature against the hull, the color at dawn, the behavior of the birds, which species, how far from shore they flew, whether they circled or moved in lines, the smell of the wind. Salt is not just salt, it has layers. Salt near land carries the ghost of soil. Salt in the deep ocean carries nothing but itself. He sailed east. For 3 days the wind cooperated. The sails filled. The ship moved at a pace that felt like purpose. Sengbei stood beside Kofi for hours at a time, watching the compass, watching the sails, as watching the man who had emerged from nowhere and taken control of the only thing that mattered. "Teach me," Sengbei said on the second day. Kofi pointed upward. "That one, Polaris, the North Star. It does not move. Everything else in the sky moves around it. As long as you can see it, you know where north is. And if you know north, you know everything." Sengbei squinted. "You speak of the stars the way I speak of rice fields, because it is the same thing. A farmer reads the soil, a sailor reads the sky. We are both reading the earth, just from different angles." Sengbei almost smiled. It was the first time anything close to a smile had appeared on his face since the chains had come off. But the sea was not finished testing them. On the 5th day, a storm arrived, not gradually, but all at once, the way storms arrive at sea, as though the sky had been holding something back and suddenly decided to let go. The wind shifted from south to west. The waves rose to heights that made the schooner feel like a toy. As rain came sideways, hard enough to sting the skin, and the sails, which Kofi had trimmed for a following, as wind, were suddenly wrong for everything. He fought the wheel for 6 hours. His arms burned. The salt water cracked his lips and blinded his eyes. Sengbei and 3 other men held the ropes, pulling when Kofi shouted, releasing when he raised his hand, as learning the language of sailing in the worst possible classroom. By the time the storm passed, they had been pushed 40 miles off course, and 2 barrels of fresh water had broken loose and rolled overboard. Water. As the thing that surrounded them in every direction was the thing they could not drink. The irony was not lost on Kofi. He rationed what remained. Half a cup per person per day, as enough to keep the body working, not enough to keep it from complaining. It was during the water rationing on the 8th night that Osi found him. The old man moved slowly across the deck, his body bent by age and by something heavier, the particular as curvature of a man who has been carrying a truth he does not want. As he lowered himself beside Kofi at the wheel and sat there for a long time, saying nothing, looking at the stars as though they were faces he once knew. Then he spoke. "The wave on your shoulder. The tattoo. You are Fonte, Cape Coast." Kofi's hand tightened on the wheel. As no one on the ship had recognized him, no one had known where he came from. In the hold in the dark, all origins dissolve. You become simply a body in chains. But this old man had seen the tattoo, the wave pattern that every Fonte fisherman's son receives at 14, and had read it like a word, written in a language only 2 people in the world still spoke. "I am Fonte," Kofi said. "I knew your father," Osi said. "He fished the waters east of the castle. A good man, a good sailor, you have his hands." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of a conversation that had not yet been spoken but was pressing against both of them like a tide that could not be held. "I know who sold us," Osi said. Kofi did not move. "Kweku, the chief, the man you called uncle. He owed the Portuguese traders for guns and cloth and rum. More than he could pay, so he paid with us." Osi's voice was flat, not angry. Anger requires surprise, and Osi had spent the entire voyage moving past surprise into something worse, certainty. He waited until the fishing boats were beyond the reef. Then he signaled the traders. As they were waiting, "You're lying. I saw his face when they came." He looked away, but I saw it. He knew. He had arranged everything. The wind pushed the sails. The ship moved forward. And inside Kofi, something that had been pointing east, toward home, toward the coast he had been born on, toward the reef where his father had taught him to read the waves, shifted. Not broken, redirected. The way a river redirects when it meets a rock too large to move. As home had not been taken from him, home had pushed him into the ocean. Osi lived for 3 more days. His body, which had survived the crossing from Africa to Cuba and the revolt and the weeks of open sea, finally reached the place where endurance becomes arithmetic, and the numbers no longer add up. On his last morning, he gripped Kofi's arm with a strength that did not match his body and said as words that would change the direction of everything. Don't go back to Cape Coast, boy. There is nothing there for you except the man who sold you. Find a new coast, one that has not learned to betray its own. He died with his eyes open, looking at the sky, as though the stars he had watched every night of the voyage had finally agreed to show him something worth seeing. They wrapped him in sailcloth. Kofi lowered him over the side. The ocean received him the way it receives all things, without ceremony, without judgment, without return. And Kofi stood at the railing with his hand still on the rope and understood that the sea he had, as loved his whole life, was also the sea that had swallowed everything. Home is not the land that raised you, as home is the land that does not sell you. If you must choose between the past and the living, choose the living. That night Kofi stood at the wheel alone. East was the direction of Africa, of Cape Coast, of the reef and the boats and the man who had traded him for gunpowder, as north was the direction of something else. A continent he had never seen, a language he did not speak, as a set of laws that, according to the traders who used to dock at Cape Coast, said the Atlantic slave trade was illegal. Not slavery itself, but the trade, the ships, the crossing, the taking of free people from one continent and carrying them to another. That, the law said, was a crime. A crime means a court means a chance. He looked at Polaris, the star that does not move, the fixed point around which everything else revolves. Every star in the sky moves. Only one stays still. Perhaps that is what truth looks like, the thing that does not move, as no matter which way the wind blows. He gathered them at dawn. 40 faces on the deck, bleached by sun and salt, thinner than they had been, as older than they should have been. Some sat, some stood. Abeni leaned against the mast, her arms wrapped around a belly that had grown visible in the weeks since as revolt, a life that had not existed when the chains were still on, or perhaps had hidden, waiting for a world worth entering. Kofi spoke from the wheel. He did not let go of it. The wheel was his authority now, the way a crown is a king's authority, not because it is powerful in itself, but because it represents the ability to choose a direction. He told them about Montes, about the stars, about the zigzag course. They already knew. He told them he had corrected the heading. They already knew that, too. Then he told them about Osei, about Cape Coast, about the chief who had sold them. The silence that followed was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of recognition, as several faces changed, not with surprise, but with the particular expression of people who had suspected something and are now hearing it confirmed. The slave trade did not run on strangers. It ran on familiarity, on chiefs who knew which families could be taken, on neighbors who looked away, on debts that were paid in bodies instead of gold. I can take us east, Kofi said, back to Africa. I know the way, but I cannot promise what waits for us there. Some of you will find your families. Some of you will find the men who sold you. And some of you will find that the home you remember no longer exists. Sengbi stepped forward. He had been standing at the bow, where he always stood, facing the direction of travel, as though his body could pull the ship forward by sheer will. Africa is home, he said. His voice was firm, not loud. The firmness of a man who has already decided and is only saying as words so the air can hear them, whatever it has become. My wife is there. My children are there. My rice field is there. I would rather face the man who betrayed me than live as a stranger in a land that does not know my name. A murmur moved through the deck. Heads nodded. Hands gripped the railing. East. Home. The word itself was a magnet, pulling bodies toward it even when the mind knew better. Then Abeni stood. She moved away from the mast slowly, one hand on her belly, and the deck fell quiet, not because she raised her voice, but because the sight of her carried a weight that words could not match. She was the future, standing upright, and the future does not need to shout. I carry a child who has no home yet, she said. This child was not conceived in freedom, but it will be born in it if I choose the right shore. She looked at Sengbe, as with opposition, with the clarity of a woman who has nothing left to protect except the thing growing inside her. Home is not a place behind us. Home is wherever this child is born free. The deck split, not physically, but the air divided, one half pulling east, the other pulling toward something unnamed, unmapped, unknown. 40 people, each carrying a different loss, each pointing toward a different version of survival. Kofi let them speak. He let the arguments rise and fall like waves. He let the tears come and the voices crack and the silences grow long and heavy with the weight of lives that had been broken in ways that no direction on a compass could fix. Then he turned the wheel. "I have been a sailor since I was 5 years old," he said. "The sea has taught me one thing the land never could. When the wind changes, you do not argue with it, you read it, you adjust, and you sail." He pointed north. "There is a coast in that direction where the law says what was done to us is a crime. Not a misfortune, not a tradition, a crime. If we reach that coast and tell our story to their courts, the law will speak for us, not because they care about us. Because the law, when it works, does not ask what color you are. It asks what happened." He paused. The wind filled the pause the way the sea fills the space between rocks, completely, impatiently. "I am not choosing a country, I am choosing a chance. The sea taught me that you cannot control the storm, but you can choose which shore it carries you to." Sengbe looked at him. The rice farmer from Sierra Leone looked at the fisherman from Ghana across a deck stained with salt and blood, and weeks of open ocean, and something passed between them that was not agreement, it was trust. The kind of trust that does not require understanding. The kind that says, "I do not know where you are taking me, but I know you have been reading the sky longer than I have been reading the soil. I trust the man who knows the sea," Sengbe said. The wheel turned. The bow swung north. The sails caught a wind that seemed to have been waiting, patient, steady, blowing from the south as though the ocean itself had an opinion about which direction 40 stolen lives should go. As weeks passed, the water changed color, the air changed temperature, as birds appeared. Not the deep-sea birds that circle without landing, but coastal birds, low-flying, purposeful, as the kind that know where land is, because they have somewhere to return to. On a morning in late August, the coast appeared, a low, as gray-green line on the horizon that thickened with every hour. Long Island, New York, as the edge of a continent that did not know they were coming. A naval brig found them before they reached the shore, the USS Washington, armed, official. As the officers who boarded the schooner saw 40 black men and women on a ship with a Spanish name and a Spanish navigator tied to the mast, and they drew the conclusions that men in uniforms draw, which is to say, the wrong ones. The chains came back, iron on wrists that had only just learned what it felt like to be bare. Kofi held out his hands, not in surrender, in offering. Because the chains this time would lead to a courtroom, not a plantation. And a courtroom was a battlefield he had not yet tried. Homegirl. The courtroom was smaller than he expected. Wood-paneled, cold, filled with white faces arranged in rows like crops planted in a field he did not recognize. The judge sat above everyone, the way the sky sits above the sea, distant, impersonal, holding the power to move everything beneath it. Kofi stood. Through an interpreter, a man who spoke Fante found after weeks of searching, he told his story. Not the story of the revolt, the story of the stars. "I was a fisherman. I read the sky for a living. They put me in a hold where there were no stars. As when I got them back, I used them to bring us here. Because here, someone told me, the law says we are human. I came to find out if that is true." The courtroom was silent. As the kind of silence that happens when a room full of people realizes they are hearing something they will remember for the rest of their lives. The lawyers argued. The Spanish government demanded their return. The president wanted them sent back to avoid a diplomatic incident. But the law, the slow, imperfect, magnificent machinery of the law, ground forward. Treaties were cited. Evidence was presented. The truth, which does not need to shout, was spoken in a room where shouting was not allowed. The court ruled they were free, not property, not cargo, as not merchandise. Free people kidnapped in violation of international law, with every right to defend themselves, and every right to stand on this shore without chains. As when the interpreter turned to the group and said the word, "Free, Sengbe," the man who had led the revolt, the man who had faced the captain with a cane knife, the man whose voice had never wavered in the hold of the ship, or on the deck of the schooner, as or in the wind of the open Atlantic, sat down on the courtroom floor and pressed his face into his hands. He had fought the crew, he had fought the ocean. He had fought the silence of a world that did not care whether he lived or died. But he had not been prepared to fight the word free and lose to it completely. As, in the months that followed, while the case wound through its appeals, Abeni gave birth. A girl, born on American soil, in a house in Connecticut provided by abolitionists who had taken up their cause. Born without chains, born without a master's name written in a ledger, born into a silence that was not the silence of fear but the silence of beginning. Kofi came to see her on the first morning. The child was small and dark and impossibly alive, as her fingers curling around the air, as though trying to hold something that had not yet arrived. She needs a name, Abeni said. Kofi looked at the child. He thought of Cape Coast and the waves. He thought of Sierra Leone and the rice fields. He thought of the Atlantic, which had tried to kill them and had instead carried them somewhere no one had planned to go. He gave the child a name drawn from 3 worlds, a Fant name for the day she was born, a Mende name for the courage of her mother, and a new name, one that belonged to no language, and no country for the life that would be hers alone. A name from 3 worlds, he said, because she does not belong to one. The child gripped his finger, and Kofi felt something he had never felt at sea, the pull of an anchor, as not the kind that holds a ship in place against its will. The kind that holds a man in place because he has finally found a place worth staying, as 35 chose to return. Sengbi led them. He stood on the dock in New Haven on a November morning, as the wind carrying the first cold of a winter he would not stay to feel, and he looked at Kofi the way you look at someone who has changed the shape of your life without asking permission. You gave us the stars, sailor. Keep them. Kofi reached out and clasped his hand. You gave me something I never had on the sea. What? A direction worth choosing. Sengbei held the grip for a moment longer than necessary. Then he turned, walked up the gangplank, and did not look back. The ship left the harbor, the sails filled. The bow pointed east, toward Africa, toward home, toward whatever waited on the other side of an ocean that, had been crossed too many times by too many people who had not chosen to cross it. Kofi watched until the sails became a white dot on the horizon, then less than a dot, then nothing. He did not go back, not because he had forgotten Cape Coast, not because he feared the chief who had sold him, because the sea here was the same sea, the stars here were the same stars, and Kofi had learned, as somewhere between the hold of a slave ship and the wheel of a stolen schooner, as that home is not a place you return to. Home is a place where the things you carry, as knowledge, the memory, the names of the stars, still matter. He found work on a fishing boat off the coast of Connecticut. The other fishermen did not know his story, as they knew only that the quiet man with the wave tattoo on his shoulder could read the weather before it, has arrived, could find fish in waters that looked empty, and could sail through a night so dark that the horizon disappeared without fear, without hesitation, without ever once looking lost. As on clear evenings, he sat on the dock with Abeni's daughter on his knee and pointed at the sky. That one, he said. Polaris, the North Star, it does not move. Everything else moves around it. The girl looked up, her eyes wide dark, as full of a future that no one on the ship could have imagined, found the star and held it. Why doesn't it move? She asked. Kofi smiled. It was the same question his father had asked him 30 years ago on a fishing boat off Cape Coast. And the answer was the same now as it was then. Because someone has to stay still so the rest of us know where we are. The star held. The sea held. And the knowledge, passed from a fisherman in Ghana to his son in chains to a child born free on a shore no one had chosen, held too, the way light holds. The way water holds. The way a song holds in the throat of someone who refuses to stop singing. They chained his body. They chained his legs. They chained his wrists to 40 men in a hold that smelled, as of fear and salt and iron. But they could not chain the one thing that set him free. Map he carried in his head, written not in ink but in starlight. Kofi sailed, and the stars followed him home.